Good evening. It's amazing that Venerable Children made it through a 4-week teaching tour in Asia, 3 countries in 4 weeks, without getting sick at all. And she even made it through the long weekend teaching Bodhisattva retreat without getting sick. And then on Tuesday, she succumbed to a cold. So tonight, I'll be leading the review. And any one of these senior nuns could have led the review tonight, but I put my hand up fast, so here I am.
It's appreciated.
Okay, so let's take a moment to generate our motivation. There is a chant that we do each week. I think it's Wednesdays, I'm not sure. Parting from the Four Clingings, it's on Wednesdays. And there's a part of that chant that really makes me perk up and pay attention. It says, "Those who engage in study and reflection are enriched by resources that enhance knowledge. They are endowed with the light that dispels ignorance. They are familiar with the road to guide sentient beings. They are endowed with the seed of the Dharmakaya. You cannot succeed without study and reflection. As for the study and reflection that clings to this life, it provides resources that produce conceit. It causes contempt for those inferior in learning and reflection. It causes envy towards those who possess learning and reflection. It causes you to seek retinues and wealth. It's the root that brings forth lower transmigration. So cast aside study and reflection driven by the 8 concerns." And these are very good advice to take on board as we engage in study, especially something like logic and reasoning. And remembering that we're doing this study so that we can increase our knowledge and so that we can help others increase their knowledge. The fact is, we need to overcome so many wrong consciousnesses that cause us suffering now and in the future. And to do that, we necessarily must develop correct consciousnesses, valid consciousnesses. And some of the objects with which we need to develop those correct consciousnesses or valid consciousnesses are hidden phenomena, slightly hidden phenomena. And so we can't perceive them directly using our senses. We must rely on developing logic and reasoning. And so for that reason, for that purpose, then we're engaging in the study of this beautiful text called The Course in Buddhist Reasoning and Debate. And so let's keep in mind that we're doing this study so that we can be of perfect benefit to all living beings, so many of them who suffer incredibly for eons and eons in terrible conditions. So let's generate a strong bodhicitta motivation for our time together tonight. So if you turn to page 12 in the Blue Book, we'll begin by reciting the homage to Manjushri. And just before we do that, I want to tell a little story. Over the weekend, we had Venerable's teachings in the morning, and then several of us gave talks in the afternoons. And on Sunday, Venerable Chuni gave a fine talk about the mind and various things. And there were a few things in that talk that my ears perked up, and I thought, And so on Monday, after the course finished, I sent her a consequence to one thing that I thought I heard. And so we began this debate over the internet, even though our offices are just around the corner. But we began this debate about this particular topic. It started with a very good motivation. And she's just back from India, so she's very enthusiastic about debate and philosophy. And so after about the 6th or 7th exchange, I realized she's not accepting my answers. And I noticed a little bit of irritation arising, a little righteousness, actually. And luckily, through the blessings of the Buddhas, I also heard a little voice say, "You are in danger. You are in danger right now, because you are now creating causes for suffering what started out as with a good motivation. I'm assuming Venerable Chuni always had a bodhicitta motivation. For myself, it started with a good motivation. But, being a person controlled by self-cherishing, these things arise. So luckily in that moment, I was able to catch it, and then we just finished our debate. So this is something that I personally need to pay attention to as I go through this study. Competition, jealousy, pride, those things crop up very easily when we start to take on some knowledge. And those things can become a real hindrance. So we have to be careful. As Geshe Tashi Tsering used to say, we can easily turn gods into devils. That means we can take something so precious like the Dharma and actually use it to create suffering. So with that in mind, then, let's recite this homage to Manjushri and use that as an inspiration. Obeisance to my Guru and Protector Manjushri, who holds to his heart a scriptural text symbolic of his seeing all things as they are, whose intelligence shines forth like the sun unclouded by the two obscurations, who teaches in 60 ways with the loving compassion of a parent for his only child, all wanderers caught in the prison of samsara, confused in the darkness of their ignorance, overwhelmed by their suffering. You whose dragon thunder proclamation of Dharma arouses us from the stupor of our delusion and frees us from the iron chains of our karma, who wields the sword of wisdom, hewing down suffering wherever its sprouts appear, clearing away the darkness of ignorance. You whose princely body is adorned with the 112 marks of a Buddha, who has completed the stages achieving the highest perfection of a bodhisattva, who has been pure from the beginning. I bow down to you, O Manjushri. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind, enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain. Okay, so last week we began looking at chapter 6 on syllogisms. And so we'll just go through that again and make sure that we understand the terms and make sure we understand how to apply some of these terms. So we're on, chapter 6 is called the Buddhist Syllogism. In the text it's page 99. So we begin by looking at there are two main argument forms used in Buddhist debate to defeat wrong conceptions and support clear understanding: syllogisms and consequences. And so syllogisms are a thesis and a reason in a single sentence. It's not a definition, but it's a nice way to understand the components of a syllogism. And then consequences flow from the logical implications of others' assertions. One way to detect when a person is throwing a consequence is that typically it starts with the words, "it follows that," because you're using the other person's logic and reasoning and you're giving it back to them in the form of a consequence. So it follows from what you've said, Okay. So let's look at the argument form beginning on page 100. So I've gone through and I've just picked out some of the main parts, some of the main aspects. And really this is, I think, a good way to study is to read back through what we've covered in the, whatever the week is, what we've covered, and then for yourself pull out the main points and make a summary. And also pull out the points that you're not clear about. Often the great teachers say, know what you know and know what you don't know. So that if we can identify what we don't know, then we have a chance to develop wisdom about that. So let's begin by looking at the argument form. It's interesting that he begins by saying that the only value of an argument is in its efficacy to bring forth new knowledge. So in other words, we're not debating for debating's sake, we're not debating to be competitive, to subdue anyone really, other than our own ignorance and maybe the ignorance of another person. Okay, so the argument form is valid only in relation to certain persons at certain times. So that's important to understand that the argument form or the syllogism or the consequence is meant for a particular opponent in any given time. There are four main characteristics involved in determining the validity of a syllogism or an argument form. And so we've seen three of these before several times. The property of the subject, the forward pervasion, and the counter pervasion. And then he adds the epistemological requirements. And we'll see what that means when we get to that section. So going through that first page, page 100, these are the things that I pulled out as being the main points. You may have underlined or pulled out other points, and fair enough, we'll all have our own, the things that stand out to us or the things that are interesting to us. So we're identifying the aspects of a syllogism. He says the argument form is called an enthymeme. And that's an informal argument in which the proof statement is suppressed or not explicitly stated. For example, in the syllogism that we've been using, the subject sound is an impermanent phenomenon because it's a product. Because of being a product, then the proof statement is all products are impermanent. So that's not explicitly stated in that syllogism, but it's implied. And so that's like the major implication. So then we are looking at the elements of a syllogism. If we use that example, the subject sound is an impermanent phenomena. If I start to change and insert self, I will probably just say sound. So I'm just going to stick with sound. The subject sound is an impermanent phenomena because of being a product. So what's the subject there?
Sound. Subject sound.
The subject is sound. And what are other terms that are synonymous or mutually inclusive with the subject?
Basis of argument or basis of debate.
Do we have microphones tonight?
Yes.
Yeah, the basis of debate. There's another one there in that section. The basis of inference, right. So this is a challenging part of this study, is that there are so many different terms for pointing to the same aspect of the syllogism. And so we can try to use the same one each time, but we may find in different literature that these different terms are used. So it's good to be familiar with them. So subject or basis of debate, the basis of inference, those are all pointing to the same thing. Then the predicate to be proven, the predicate of the probandum, those are all referring to the same thing. And so there, what is the predicate?
It's an impermanent phenomenon.
An impermanent phenomena. And then if we put those two things together, we come up with the thesis, or the probandum. Okay, so what is the thesis or the probandum there?
The subject sound is an impermanent phenomenon.
Right, the subject sound is an impermanent phenomena. Okay, and then the reason stands out, doesn't it? What's the reason? Product. And reason is synonymous with several other words. Do you remember those? Sign is one. Proof is another one. And that's tricky because sometimes proof is referring to the syllogism and sometimes the proof is referring to the reason or the subject. The reason or the sign. It seemed that Venerable wanted to use the word reason, so we'll try to insert that when it's appropriate. And then I think this comes up a little bit later, but I included it in this list of terms, and that is the opposite of the thesis. And we'll see as we continue our study why that's important to identify the opposite of the thesis. So if the thesis here is sound is an impermanent phenomena, then what's the opposite of that? Sound is a non-impermanent phenomenon. We'll see how that fits in. Okay. So just going through page 100 and the top of page 101, these are the key elements that I've pulled out. Do you have anything else underlined that you thought was important? Or any other points that you remember Venerable making about this section? He does begin to talk about, on the top of page 101, consequently, this terse argument form implies a series of premises and a conclusion, and he draws that out more specifically a little bit later, but we could talk about that now. There are these two premises in the syllogism. Do you remember what they were? Sound is a product, that's one of them. Mm-hmm. The microphone. Thank you.
And that products are impermanent.
Products are impermanent. Right, those are the two premises, and then the conclusion is? Sound is impermanent. That's right. Okay, so let's look at the element of a syllogism. The series of sentences implied by the single sentence form of the Buddhist syllogism is predicated by cross-relating the three basic units of that syllogism. So we're just going to be playing with these three different elements. These three are the subject, the predicate to be proven, and the reason, or more typically known as the sign. Okay, so there's a cross-relating of these three basic units of the syllogism. The property of the subject, I've made that under tools and autocorrect, I've made that pots. You can just put in pots and it comes out property of the subject. So this means that the reason, the subject is, wait a minute, is the reason. Okay, so we're asking a question. Is the reason a property or a quality or an attribute of the subject? That's the question that we're asking to see, to understand, is there a property of the subject in this, established in this syllogism? Now, something that hasn't come up here, that will come up later, is if the property of the subject is not established for some reason, like if the reason is not a quality or an attribute of the subject, we would say, reason not established. We'll come to that. Maybe you've heard that before in different debates, reason not established. Typically, that's where that comes. Okay, so it's important to realize that the relationship, the cross-relation here in the property of the subject is looking to see, is the reason a quality of the subject? Does it have that quality? Or, as we will see in different syllogisms, does the reason exist at the place of the subject? If there's a, like, take it on the subject, on a Smoky Mountain Pass there is fire because there is smoke. Although it says there is fire, it's assuming fire exists. So smoke is the reason there. On a Smoky Mountain Pass there is fire because there is smoke. On a Smoky Mountain Pass there is smoke. Smoke exists on a Smoky Mountain Pass. Okay, so that's the we're seeing. It depends on the type of syllogism, whether it's an is syllogism or an exist syllogism, how we look at the property of the subject. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Was that clear?
One thing that helps me with that is to tell myself why they're different, which is like try to say, you're not going to say the mountain pass is smoke. You know what I mean? It's not like it is smoke. It's smoke exists there. So I have to kind of walk myself through it sometimes.
Thank you. Yeah, one is trying to think. On a Smoky Mountain Pass, there is smoke. Oh, no, there's smoke. I'm just looking at the property of the subject.
Oh, yeah.
On a Smoky Mountain Pass, there is smoke. Is that a statement of quality or a statement of pervasion? The Smoky Mountain Pass is smoky, is a statement of quality. There is smoke. Let's save that for now. We'll continue thinking about that. It's going to come up here in a minute. Okay. So we're looking at the property of the subject. We're also looking at the forward pervasion. Does the reason pervade the predicate? So I know some of you have learned that little equation. We can use numbers or letters. What do you prefer? 1, 2, and 3, A, B, and C? A, B, and C. Okay, so when you're looking to understand the property of the subject, you say, is C a quality of A? Is C A? Is C A? And then for the forward pervasion, you say, if it's C, is it necessarily B? If it's the reason, is it necessarily the predicate? The predicate's going to be the larger circle that pervades the reason. It's either going to be the same size or it's going to be larger and pervade the reason, as we'll see. Okay, so does the reason pervade the predicate? And then the counter pervasion. Does the opposite of the predicate pervade the opposite of the reason? So if it's not B, it's necessarily not C. If it's not the predicate, it's necessarily not the reason. So that's a shorthand way of looking at this. Of course, as I'm not sure if he goes into similar classes and dissimilar. You've read ahead. Does he talk about similar and dissimilar classes? Okay, so it's a little more complicated than just A, B, and C, but this is a great start. If we can get this down, this helps us to know how to begin analyzing a syllogism to see if it's a correct reason or not. Okay, now in this section there's a very important piece that we need to pull out, and it's at the bottom of page 101. It starts with, the subject is the basis with respect to which a person is seeking to learn something. Okay, so let's just read through that paragraph. According to the tradition, a proper subject of a syllogism, also known as a basis of debate or a basis of inference, so there's the synonyms, must meet two requirements, one formal and one epistemological. First, the subject must be held as the basis of debate in a syllogism. For example, sound is held as the subject in the proof of sound as an impermanent phenomena. Basically, what we're saying is it's the subject. So what we're doing here is we're looking to assess, is there a flawless subject of interest? And if there is, it has to have these two qualities. One is that the subject must be held as the basis of the debate, the subject, in a particular syllogism. Okay, so in other words, a subject must occupy the first position in a syllogism. Second, as in the sample syllogism, there must be a person who has ascertained that sound is a product. So there's a person who's already ascertained the property of the subject. They already know that. They've ascertained it. Sound is a product. Or the sound, that sound has the quality given as the reason, the product. And that person must now be engaged in wanting to know whether or not sound is an impermanent phenomena. So already we have these three criteria that must be present for us to have an actual flawless subject of interest of a syllogism. So he hasn't used that terminology. I hope it's not too awkward to hear that term, but you will read that in, like, Catherine Rogers' debate book, and it's good to know that's a flawless subject of interest.
I've gone on over these qualities of the subject quite a few times, and I still don't get this first thing that says first the subject must be held as a basis of debate in the syllogism. In other words, it holds the first position.
The microphone's not amplifying, they're just putting you into this.
I see.
So you'll need to project.
You can speak a little louder.
Okay. Where was I?
Read that sentence.
So you've read that sentence, the subject must be held as the basis of debate in a syllogism, and you're wondering,
Right.
is it?
And it must be in the first position.
Mhm.
So the syllogism form is built so that the subject is in the first position. So why is this a point, a requirement that we have to learn? It seems to me there must be something in there that I don't get, because it's created, it's self-evident that the subject is the first part of the syllogism. So what's the point here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
This would be a good thesis topic. To go back and really ferret out, where did all these things come from? In Dharmakirti's writing, was he talking about these flawless subjects of interest? Who was it who first put forward these criteria for that particular element? Where did they come from, and how have they morphed or transformed as they've gone into the Tibetan debating system? It'd be interesting to know. And that's not the level of study that I've done. Yeah.
So you could say, because of being a product, sound is an impermanent phenomena, and that changes where it sits in the sentence. But when they say the first place in the syllogism, are they talking about of importance or in order? Because you could reorder that sentence, at least in English.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, typically the subject comes first with the predicate, and that's what you're trying to prove, the thesis, and then you're given a reason. Yeah, these are questions I don't know. I can't answer. We can ask Professor Jeffrey Hopkins. Yeah, if he'll entertain the distraction. In the definition of this term, it talks about a common locus between the subject and a person. Okay, so you've got the subject in the syllogism, and then a person who has ascertained the position property, or the property of the subject, and has this doubt about the thesis. So these are the three qualities that are necessary for a real correct syllogism. Now, of course, as we begin debating with each other, we probably won't have flawless subjects of interest, and we're still going to debate, and we'll still get a lot out of it. But if we were truly using this, well, actually, we may be our own flawless subject of interest at some point when we're positing syllogisms to ourselves. We may have come to understand something or ascertain something. Like, for instance, sound is a product. We can ascertain that right now. Look, I had to do something. It's a caused phenomena. Sound is a caused phenomena. I just caused it. Or our voice is a caused phenomena, bringing together vocal cords and some effort, some wind, and the way I move my tongue and my mouth, then that produces sound. That's a caused phenomena. Oh, we can ascertain that, right? Right, so we can ascertain the property of the subject. But when we're talking about sound being impermanent, there are different levels of impermanence, for sure. There's gross impermanence, there's subtle impermanence. But here in this syllogism, the Buddhists were debating with people non-Buddhists, who were putting forth the assertion that space had a quality of permanence, and it had something to do with the Vedas. But space had this quality of permanence, and so to count, sound pervaded space, there we go. And sound was permanent, there we go. Okay. So to counter them, then they needed to prove the subtle impermanence of sound. So in general, we could say that impermanence and product are mutually inclusive. In a way, you can say that. But typically, and this is where some study of collected topics comes into play. Typically in collected topics, when you're talking about impermanence, you're talking about momentary and you're talking about subtle impermanence. So as we go along, we will pick up more of the vernacular of collected topics so that we understand these things. Yes? Okay, so the subject, it's these two sections. The first one is the subject must be held as a basis of debate, must be held as the subject. Basis of debate in the syllogism, for example, sound held as a subject in the proof sound is an impermanent phenomena. And there must be a person who has two qualities, a person who has ascertained the property of the subject, POTS, and has a doubt about the thesis. There's a common locus between those two things. So this person has begun the reasoning process, but they haven't completed it. They still have a doubt. Okay, so because there are these criteria, then we can understand that any one syllogism is not going to be valid for all people in all contexts. That's something to take from that. Okay, so he makes the point very clearly here. He says, having certain knowledge about the basis of debate, or the subject, is seeking to know something further. Okay, he says this is not valid for a dog. Well, obviously. It's also not valid for what he calls an unprepared person. Who would be an unprepared person? Yep. Oh. Well, they would have certain qualities.
People in my family. They're not interested.
People who aren't interested, yes, so, okay, that's a general way of answering that. We could also say it's a person who hasn't ascertained that sound is a product, or if they have, they don't have a doubt about whether sound is subtly impermanent or not. Yeah, they don't care. They have no interest in that. And this is also not a valid syllogism for someone like Dharmakirti. Why is that? Because he's already realized that sound is impermanent. And the Buddha, of course the Buddha. But someone like Dharmakirti or any of the great logicians who would have had realizations of subtle impermanence. Yeah, the Buddha doesn't wonder whether sound is impermanent. Okay. So there's a lot in that section. And he uses a lot of words to really make those few points, I thought. But I encourage you to read through it again and, with respect, I think it's fine to highlight a book with respect. We do need to do it with respect because this is a Dharma text. This is teaching us how to engage with the Dharma. So, with a real reason, then we can make notes about what's important to us and what we want to hang on to. Okay, anything else from that section? Yes?
As far as the proper person or an unprepared person, what about someone who is interested and does realize that sound is a product, but doesn't really have any knowledge about products being impermanent? Are they fine as far as being? Because then that's what you're working through, huh?
That's a good question. Actually, although it's not spelled out in the flawless subject of interest, that person also has to have realized that a product is impermanent. They've already realized the forward pervasion.
They have to have realized that, okay.
Yeah.
They can't just be at the point of working that out.
Well, it depends. If they're using that syllogism for themselves, they can certainly be in the position of working that out for themselves. If we were trying to provide a debate for somebody, we would probably need to wait until they had come to that conclusion. Because otherwise, they won't be able to make the conclusion that sound is impermanent.
So then we would have to offer syllogisms about why a product is necessarily impermanent,
Yep.
and then come back to the original syllogism.
Right. So take sound, it's impermanent because it's a product. Let's see, how would you do that?
Maybe give it an illustration. Would help.
Yes, I'm trying to think of one. I'm trying to think how you would do that. If the person wasn't aware of that proof statement.
Then they might say it isn't established that products are impermanent, and you'd have to convince them of that.
Well, we're not trying. Are we trying to convince? We're trying
you'd
to lead someone to
lead
develop
them
their
to
own
that.
realization of
Right,
something.
yeah.
We're not trying to convince.
But you'd have to offer something to lead them in that direction.
Maybe you could do a consequence of if products were permanent, how would they, kind of help them to understand that they have to be impermanent, given the consequence of them being permanent.
Okay. So if the person had understood the property of the subject, so they know that sound is a product, and then you might say whatever. Okay, take the subject, or we used to say take the subject, or we'd say take sound. So the sound, the subject, or take sound. It is take a product, it is impermanent because it's momentary. You could use that. So now you're using the definition to prove. You've put the reason in the predicate position, and now you're going to provide a new reason that is supposedly easier to understand than the predicate itself. So take a product, it is impermanent because it is momentary. They would have to know, and this is tricky, they would have to know that a product is momentary. Okay, they could probably ascertain that. And then whatever is momentary is impermanent. So they're putting pieces together. You know, it's hard to say, how do they actually realize that what is momentary is impermanent? You know, there are certain things that you think about and you think about and you think about, and all of a sudden you go, oh. You know, somehow the pieces fall into place. How do you describe that?
I think this is why in Catherine Rogers' book, she writes a lot of pages about the flawless subject. You know, there's
Yeah.
a lot of pages on it. And then when you get later in the book, you're like, she talks about the flawless subject, and then you realize, oh, I don't really understand it. Now I have to go back and read the flawless subject again because she starts applying it. So it seems so simple, but then as soon as I start using it, then there were like these nuances, like the question that he just asked.
Yeah. It's a good question, thank you. And let's hold that and see if we can discover it as we go along. Yeah.
I want to check, too, that when we are talking about something even as that looks like it's so self-evident, is sound is impermanent. You know, we think, yeah, I know that one, and so we blow it off.
We don't know that one.
But what we're looking at here is that as an absolute, incontrovertible realization of
Right.
the impermanence of that sound at an extremely subtle level. So there's something about assuming that we already know something that we don't know. I guess it was partly what I was talking about last week, because we say I know so easily. But here we're talking about I know incontrovertibly because I've realized it. And that leads us to a different place, I think, if we're holding, at least when I think about it that way. It takes my mind to a different place when I try to look at a syllogism.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I didn't bring these books just for show and tell, Catherine Rogers in Tibetan Logic has a nice section on what does it mean to ascertain. And it doesn't maybe specifically spell out that it is a valid cognition, it's a realization, but it kind of gets to it. Yeah, gets to it. So it's a good point what you're bringing up, and it's true that we should remember that when we're talking about realizing subtle impermanence, well, it depends which tenet school we're talking about, what kind of mind realizes that. But it's a hidden phenomena. It's a very hidden phenomena. Wait, hidden, very hidden, extremely hidden. It's a very hidden phenomena. So we can't get at that through our senses. We're going to have to know that by relying on an inference, a logical syllogism. Yeah, and as you're saying, we're not just trying to generally understand it, we're trying to develop incontrovertible knowing, a valid cognition that cannot be taken away. Yeah. If we think about it for a moment, if we had a realization of subtle impermanence, that everything, I mean, we've heard the words, and especially we're a little bit spoiled in this day and age because we've been exposed to a lot of scientific explanations and also quantum physics and things like this. You know, we can say very easily that everything is vibrating and it's got more space than matter, and we know these things at a very superficial intellectual level. But imagine understanding that in every moment. How differently we would relate to people, how differently we relate to our things, ourself, everything, really. So it's a worthwhile understanding. It's not just to counter, non-Buddhists who assert a permanent, unitary, independent self. We need it. We need that realization ourselves. Yeah. Okay. All right. So thank you for that question, and we'll keep thinking about that. I'll keep thinking about that. There's one other thing we need to pick up in this section. In the proof of sound as an impermanent phenomena, that which is to be negated is that sound is a permanent phenomena. This is the opposite of the thesis that sound is an impermanent phenomena. More precisely, that which is negated is that sound is a non-impermanent phenomena, as we said earlier. Although the collected topics literature consistently reports that which is to be negated is that sound is a permanent phenomena, there is a slight verbal fault with this, for this is not the full negation of the predicate to be proven. And this would come out more clearly, or will come out more clearly, when we talk about these similar and dissimilar classes that relate to the predicate. So there will come a time where we're looking to see, does the reason wholly fit within the similar class? Like if the predicate is impermanent, then the similar class is everything that's impermanent. And the dissimilar class is everything that is non-impermanent. So we need to understand what those two terms mean. Impermanent we have down, it's momentary. But non-impermanent, let's contrast and compare. How do the two compare? Permanent phenomena and non-impermanent phenomena. Non-impermanent phenomena. How do the two compare? Okay, so how do the two compare? Permanent phenomena, because that's one way of looking at the opposite of the thesis, permanent phenomena, and non-impermanent phenomena.
Three possibilities.
So Venerable Chinny said there are three, you said there's three. Anybody have a different answer? Three? Okay. Yeah, there's three. And why is that the case?
There's non-existence.
Yep. So Venerable Pema said that they're non-existence where? Okay, so maybe we'd say it this way. Non-impermanent phenomena includes permanent phenomena and non-existence, whereas permanent phenomena only includes permanent phenomena, things that actually exist. So the non-impermanent phenomena is actually a larger category, isn't it? It pervades permanent phenomena. It's the larger category. Does that make sense? So when we had drawn, I'm sorry I didn't bring the whiteboard, but we had talked about selfless as the biggest category. You remember when we drew that on the whiteboard? And then we had existence and non-existence. And under existence we had functioning things and permanent phenomena. Functioning things meaning impermanent and permanent phenomena. So permanent phenomena is only that category right there. Whereas non-impermanent phenomena is all of this excluding impermanent phenomena, which means, as you said, permanent phenomena and non-existence. Yep. Okay, so that's good to keep in mind. So in the text, on 103, at the end of that very long first paragraph, he says, in explicitly proving that sound is an impermanent phenomena, the argument implicitly proves that is not a permanent phenomena. I wonder, I wrote in my book, or a non-existent. Did any of you? Okay, so I think,
He's being sloppy there.
well, I thought so too when he went to the trouble to make this point and then he didn't include it there. It seems a little bit odd.
Because he's going against the Vedas, and they don't care about non-existence.
Okay.
There's
Yeah, could be.
existence.
Okay, so you can just make a little note to yourself. It also includes non-existence. Okay, there's one very long first paragraph on page 103, the very last sentence.
Okay, that's right.
And it says, in explicitly proving that sound is an impermanent phenomenon, the argument implicitly proves that it is not a permanent phenomenon. That's true, that's a true statement. But it also proves that it's not a non-existent.
But he has already covered that earlier in the paragraph.
Okay, well, he's making it very clear. He does repeat himself a little bit. That's all right. We need that. So we will come to more of these definitions, but permanent phenomena has a very particular definition. It's not just non-momentary, because even non-existence are non-momentary, right? Even non-existence are non-momentary. So it's a common locus of a phenomena, meaning an existent, and non-momentary. It doesn't disintegrate moment to moment. Let me just say a few things about the reason. I see in my notes I was going through, this must be how the text is laid out, because I was reading the text, that he talks about the subject, and then the thesis, and then the opposite of the thesis, and then the reason. So again, sign, reason, and proof are all mutually inclusive. In our sample syllogism, sound is impermanent because of being a product, or sound is an impermanent phenomena because of being a product. Product alone is the sign or reason. So when asked for the reason, we don't need to include because of being a product. Anything can be stated as a reason. It doesn't have to be correct. Well, for a correct reason, it has to be correct. But there are reasons and then there are correct reasons. There are also pseudo-reasons or counterfeit reasons, I think he uses. So there are contradictory reasons. Sometimes you'll hear someone put forward a syllogism and the reason is contradictory to what you're trying to prove, the predicate. Or there are inconclusive reasons. Probably a lot of our understandings fall into these categories. We have correct assumptions, but we might have contradictory reasons, or we might have inconclusive reasons, or non-established reasons. And I suspect we'll come to that.
Do you know why that product would be the subject? Why would product be the subject instead of because of being a product? The reason. Why?
Yeah, that's an interesting
Because
question.
it seems like when we use the term reason, that is the reason we're giving.
It's complicated.
Okay.
Do you want to give it a go?
I think in the original debate book, I just read that part. And what happens if you try to do these syllogisms and you use because of being a product, things start to fall apart. It gets quite complicated. So, being something becomes something that we learn about in the collected topics. There's the whole issue of being something. There's all these, there's things that are, but nothing can be them. Remember, the two, a pillar and a pot? A pillar and a pot exists, but nothing is them. These kind of complicated things end up coming up. And so sometimes when you add these words on there, all of a sudden what you're trying to do, like you have a sign, it starts to fall apart. So if you took being a product and tried to do these forward pervasions and use the word being a product instead of just the word product, all of a sudden it might not make any sense. That's what I understood from what I read.
So it wouldn't fit into the three modes as clearly.
Right, because the modes are all about the sign alone.
Yeah.
It's all about the sign.
Although we talk about the property of the subject and the forward pervasion and the counter pervasion as being relationships, if someone asked you what is the position, the property of the subject, it's just, for example, product. Or what is the forward pervasion? It's just product. Even though if someone asks you, well, but what is, what? It's tricky. It depends on the context of what they're asking. There is a relationship that's being described by that term, but also, and we'll get to that. So correct signs or correct reasons. The correct reason is that which is the three modes. Now we're on page 104. There's the definition of a correct reason. Let's use that term. Correct reason is that which is the three modes or criteria. That's what Venerable preferred. In Daniel Perdue's debate book, he said the three modes are three criteria that a correct reason must satisfy. So, you see, that's not a definition, though. That's more of a description. No, more of a description than, yeah. Okay, so we have the three down, the pots, the forward pervasion, the counter pervasion. So again, as we mentioned earlier, there are these three sentences implied by a single syllogism, the two premises and a conclusion. So sound is a product, that's a minor premise, and products are impermanent. The reason is the predicate, that's the major premise, and then the conclusion is that sound is impermanent, the thesis. Okay, then we have a very long definition. Anybody bothered to memorize that one? No? Definition of the correct reason and the proof of sound is an impermanent phenomena by the reason product. That which is the three modes, or that which is the three criteria, in the proof of sound as an impermanent phenomena by reason product. It's not that difficult, is it? It's just long. You might think, why bother? But, that would be an important thing to understand. So this is not a definition of product. at the bottom of page 104, just after that definition, that which is the three modes and the proof of sound as an impermanent phenomena, the longest definitions, I think, are found in the study of reasons and logic. Anyway, the next sentence says, this is not a definition of product, which is the momentary. Which is the momentary. That's problematic because that's not the definition of product anyway. It's created phenomena, which we'll come to later. So I'm just keeping a list in the back of my book of things that we might like to send to the publisher and clarify. So I don't know, do we need to bring that point home any clearer, that a correct reason is that which is the three modes? So the property of the subject is, for example, product. The forward pervasion is product. The counter pervasion is product, or whatever the reason is. It will always be that reason. All three will be the reason. So, yeah.
Could you just state again the major premise, minor premise, and the conclusion? Just a little slower. Thanks.
Sure. I think it was Venerable who pointed out these minor and majors, or is it in our text?
That's right. You just said it.
Yes. So I'm just trying to remember where I.
Yeah, it's right in the text, right?
Okay.
Right above what we were just talking about, in the same paragraph.
Yeah. So the first premise is that sound is a product. That's the property of the subject, right? That's the minor premise.
That's the minor one.
Products are impermanent. That's the major premise, or sometimes it's called the proof statement.
So that's like the
The
pervasion, kind of like.
Yeah.
Is the major premise.
Right. Yes, that's a good way to remember it.
Which is what sound is.
Products are impermanent. So that's the reason. The reason is the predicate. Or if it's the reason, it's necessarily. No. If it's the predicate, it's necessarily the reason. Products are impermanent phenomena. Although that's true, if the reason were pervaded by the predicate, that would not necessarily be true. Products. Oh, no, it would. Products are impermanent. Okay, so take Seppel. She's a woman because she's a nun. Seppel is a nun. Whatever is a nun is necessarily a woman. Sometimes you have to use these simple syllogisms to figure it out.
So the subject is necessarily.
So Seppel is, or nuns are women. Yeah, that works. Okay, so products are impermanent.
That's the major premise.
Yep.
Oh. That's the minor.
That's the major. Sound as a product is the minor premise. Products are impermanent. And then sound is impermanent, is the conclusion that we're trying to develop. So that's another way of talking about those three modes or three criteria. A is C. If it's
If it's C, it is necessarily B. And then
yep.
If it's not
A.
B, it's not
When,
necessarily.
there's no counter pervasion here, but that you're right.
What page is that? A and B?
It's not in the book, or if it is, it comes later.
And Noble Children uses A, B, and C when she's taught us before.
It's a nice way to begin looking at the elements of the syllogism and just to remember the things that you're trying to, the different relationships really is what it's pointing to.
Did she talk about that last week?
Yes.
Yes.
No, okay.
It doesn't equal C. A is C. It's, like a
I'm
quality.
looking at the-
Yeah.
A is C,
A is C, meaning
and the second one is.
C is a quality of A.
and
Okay.
C.
How are you doing? Everybody still awake?
It's C is necessary.
All right, so let's begin talking about the property of the subject, the first of the three modes or three criteria in a correct reason. So here, property implies the reason is a predicate or a quality or an attribute. implies the reason is a predicate, a quality, or an attribute of the subject. Property is the reason, right? So the reason, property, the word property implies that the reason is a predicate or a quality or an attribute of the subject. So in the syllogism, the subject sound is an impermanent phenomena because of being a product. The property of the subject is present in the subject, isn't it? Product is a quality of sound. So the subject must have the quality of the reason. Or we could ask, does the subject have the quality of the reason? So does the subject sound have the quality of productness? It's interesting, he points out that in Tibetan there is this, it sort of implies ness, productness, or, as that being a quality of sound. So we should be able to state them together in a statement of quality. Sound is a product, or that subject is that reason. So in that phrase, sound is a product, is that predicate nominative or predicate adjective? Right. Predicate nominative. And sound is a product, why? Because it's caused phenomena. Yeah, it's created phenomena. Yeah, so product or productness is a quality of sound. Okay.
So quality and property are synonymous?
Property. They're similar, aren't they?
Changed.
I think so. Yeah, property. Product is a property or a quality or a attribute.
Okay, it says here.
Yeah. Okay. If we look towards not the very last paragraph, but the one above on page 105, he makes an important point here, I think. He says, thus, although technically, you see where I am in the middle of that paragraph? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7, yeah, or 7 from the top of product is the property of the subject. Thus, although technically only the sign product is the property of the subject in the sample syllogism, the first mode of the correct sign in this syllogism is formulated, sound is a product. I thought Catherine Rogers said that just a little more clearly. She said, it should be noted that although the property of the subject refers to the relationship between the reason and the subject in a correct reason, if we are asked to posit the property of the subject in the syllogism, the subject sound is an impermanent phenomena because of being a product, the response is just product.
If we were asked to do what?
Okay. So although the property of the subject, the first criteria, refers to a relationship between the subject and the reason, or the reason and the subject, in a correct reason, whatever it might be. If we're asked to posit the property of the subject, or give, or state, the property of the subject in the syllogism, the subject sound is an impermanent phenomenon because of being a product, the response is just product.
Wouldn't it be sound as a product? Because you're asking for the property of the subject.
So we're making a distinction here. Although the property of the subject does refer to that relationship, in general,
Right.
it refers to that relationship, which is, product is a quality.
The sign is everything of the three modes. You're asking now, it's kind of like asking what is the first mode? It's the sign.
Okay, listen to how Catherine Rogers says it, because I think it's quite eloquent. She says, it should be noted that although the property of the subject, the first criteria, is referring to the relationship between the reason and the subject in a correct reason, if we're asked to give the property of the subject in the syllogism, it's just product. So maybe it's like this. If you're asked, is the property of the subject established? Then you're looking for the relationship. That's the first thing you look for when you're checking to see if a syllogism is a correct reason. Is the property of the subject established? So then you're looking to see, is product, or is the reason, a quality of the subject? But if someone says to you, what is the property of the subject? You just say product.
So his answer of sound is a product is giving an answer to a different question.
Right, but in the beginning of the sentence, though, it's saying what she's telling me.
Yeah,
Right, it's in verse
I just thought
9.
she said it a little more straightforward. For me, it helped me understand what he was trying to say.
Yeah, I got it, thank you.
Any doubts about that? I suspect that, okay, when we're looking to see, so, when we're looking to see is A C, when we're asking that question, we're saying, is the property of the subject established? Do they have a relationship? So we're checking. Then we're looking at that relationship. But if someone just says, what is the property of the subject? If they ask that direct question, then you just say product or whatever the reason is. So think about it. And what I love about this stuff is that sometimes it's clear as mud. And then you think about it, and you think about it, and then all of a sudden you get the beauty of the penny dropping, and you go, oh, that's what it was trying to say. Okay, I got it now. Sometimes it just takes a little more jiggling for the penny to drop. All right. All right, so definition of something being the property of the subject in the proof of sound as an impermanent phenomena. That's up above from where we were just looking. That's that definition that's indented. Okay, so let's spend the rest of our time, just a few more minutes, looking at this this definition. That which is ascertained. Okay, so there's that word. By a person for whom it has become the property of the subject. In the proof of sound as an impermanent phenomena, as only existing in accordance with the mode of statement with sound. Why he's got his reasons for why he wants to say it that way. So, just very quickly, there's a nice explanation, I think, of the mode of statement, be and exist. And maybe this is clear to you already. I don't think it's just Tibetan, but there would be different Tibetan words, yin and yu, right, for is and exist. But that must come from, there must be similar Sanskrit distinctions as well. You can look that up for us.
I don't understand the definition.
Yeah. Okay, so let's pick it apart. Okay, so that which is ascertained, basically ascertain means something that's realized by valid cognition. So there's a person or a consciousness that's ascertaining that. And this part of the sentence that is in the parentheses is really saying in relation to a faultless subject of interest. That's what it's saying in words that may not be quite as clear as what he described earlier.
And the faultless subject of interest is sound.
Well, yes, it is. But, well, no, the faultless subject of interest is the combination of the basis of the debate in the syllogism, blah, 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 blah. And there's a person who has ascertained the property of the subject.
Yeah, I'm at confusion time right here, so
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
fine.
And understandable. Understandable.
Using the term subject, but not meaning the subject of the syllogism when you say that. You're talking about a person.
Yeah. Yeah. There is a person who has ascertained the position property and has a doubt about the thesis. So those three things are necessary for a faultless subject of interest. So for the position property to be established, we have to have, it's that which is ascertained by this faultless subject of interest as only existing in a particular mode. Maybe just stop there. In a particular mode. Okay, so what are those modes? They are is and exist modes. On page 45 in Tibetan Logic by Catherine Rogers, she says product, she's talking about that syllogism, product must be ascertained as only existing with sound in accordance with the mode of statement. There are two modes or ways of stating a syllogism, the copular and the ontological. Okay, those are big words that only mean the copular mode is an is statement and the ontological mode is an exist statement. So when we say sound is impermanent because it's a product, that's an is statement. When we say on a Smoky Mountain Pass there is fire because there is smoke, that's an exist statement. The smoke exists on a Smoky Mountain Pass. So when we're looking at 1 and 3, when we're checking that relationship, that's an exist statement. I don't understand the significance, or I couldn't explain why this is so important. Yeah, I haven't grokked that yet. So
Smoke only exists where there's fire.
yeah.
Is that what they mean by exist? You're saying
No,
Smoke exists.
okay, so we're talking about the property of the subject. So we're now examining the relationship between the subject and the reason. So the reason exists with the subject in an ontological statement. The reason is a quality of the subject in a copular statement. Where these words came from, I don't know. See, this would be very interesting to really investigate this and to see the progression of how these words came to be used. It's really, I think, for our usage, we can just say this is very simple. It's either an is statement, like a statement of quality, or it's an exist statement. That's all they're saying there. And it must have something to do with Tibetan grammar or Sanskrit grammar, which I don't understand.
It'll also change. I wish I had better memory because I'm not good at memorizing things. But it will also change how things are then stated when we state these pervasions. It will be something like,
Oh, If smoke exists, fire exists.
yeah,
That sort of thing?
Yeah, you can't say smoke is fire. You have to use, it changes how the words are. So they just say it's a is statement. It's, you're just saying it's an is statement or it's an exist statement. But it ends up, when you try to state these pervasions, you have to use different language because you're not saying the mountain is smoke.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying smoke exists there.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll actually end up wording these differently when we say the forward pervasion, I think, and maybe
Okay.
even the other one. I
So
don't know.
wherever there is smoke, there is fire.
Yeah, fire, yeah, exists.
Oh,
or something.
where
Because
smoke
we
exists,
our
fire
language
exists,
Works.
yeah.
The word is works. That's what's hard about it. But you're not
Yeah.
saying one is the other. That's how the only way I can remember it is you're not saying the mountain is smoke. You're not even saying the mountain is fire. You're saying these things exist there. Whereas when you're talking about sound, you're saying sound is
a
impermanent.
product.
Sound is a product. You're not,
Yeah.
You know, it's a different thing.
Thank you, that's very clear.
So that's how I try to keep this straight
Yeah,
as best as I can.
yeah. Are you full? All right. I'm just going to say some syllogisms and just check to see if there is a relationship between the subject and the reason. Okay, so we're just checking for the property of the subject. I have to pause there because I learned it as the position property. So the property of the subject, the pots. All right, how about this one? The subject, horn of a rabbit, is an impermanent phenomena because of being a product. Why not?
Because
horn of a rabbit is non-existent.
Yes, and?
And thus not a product.
And thus not a product.
There you go.
That's right. So product cannot be an attribute or a quality of
Of a
something that,
non-existent.
of a non-existent. There you go. Excellent. Okay, very good. The sound of a conch is an impermanent phenomena because it arose through exertion.
Say it again?
The sound of a conch. So this is part of the challenge, isn't it? You have to really listen. Okay, the subject, sound of a conch is an impermanent phenomena because it arose through exertion.
What's the definition of exertion?
Effort. I don't know if that's the definition, but it arose through effort.
Yeah,
You had it in a footnote in here.
that works.
It's okay, isn't it?
Well, it works for me.
It works as
Yeah.
long as you have to realize that exertion is a cause.
Yes. Yes. So when you go out on the balcony and blow the conch, it takes some exertion, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The sound of the conch arises due to exertion. So the position property is established. Yeah, that works.
But it's not always true, is it?
The sound of a conch.
Yeah, you could play it on the TV and know the exertion is.
That's the TV sound of a conch. That's not the sound of a conch. That's not the sound of a
There
conch.
can be things that arise without exertion, but anything that arises without exertion is caused by the exertion. Anything that arises with effort is caused. It doesn't have to be the case that everything that is caused arises through effort.
Yeah, you're squeezing here, put your microphone so we can hear what you have to say.
She's saying that something is impermanent because it arose due to effort or exertion.
The sound of a conch.
Yeah. That doesn't mean that things that don't arise through effort are not impermanent. That's
Like,
not.
for instance, the sound of wind through the trees. It doesn't arise through the effort of a human. Does it arise through effort?
No.
It's
No,
effortless?
but it still arises through causes.
Yes, okay.
And
So,
so-
there's a distinction.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
To say, otherwise we're jumping to this conclusion that all causes are exertion, and that's not true. But exertion can be a cause.
So
Is
it sounds like exertion is necessarily, like, has a living being involved with it.
It does, but the fact is anything that rises through exertion arose through a cause, exertion, and is thus impermanent.
But not all causes arise through exertion.
Right, but the thing is, that's beside the point, and we could easily conflate that and confuse the issue.
I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, good. He's sharp.
So can you say sound is exertion?
That's not what it says. It says the sound of a conch
Right.
arose through exertion. It arose. The sound that comes from a conch arose through exertion. Like,
So if you're going
blowing.
to test A is C.
Yeah.
The sound of a conch is a modifying phrase. So sound is really the subject, or the sound of a conch is the subject. The reason is
What's the whole sentence?
The sound of a conch is an impermanent phenomena because it arose through exertion. The sound of a conch,
That's the subject.
is a subject.
does it have a quality of arising through exertion?
This is one of those exist statements, not an is statement.
No, I think it's a is statement.
Because you said because, it arises because of
Sound
exertion.
arises because of.
Is an impermanent phenomenon is the predicate, and because of arising through exertion is the
Is the quality.
reason.
The quality is more than one word in this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more challenging for us.
Yeah.
Okay,
Arising through-
we'll think about that one.
But then my question is, following Venerable Losung's thing, is that don't we need a couple of syllogisms to get to the point to prove this?
Depends on what you already ascertained.
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, The sound of the gong is impermanent because it arises through exertion. We can understand that property of the subject pretty easily, can't we? Sound of a gong arises through exertion. Look, here's exertion.
I think that the sign arises through exertion.
The whole phrase is sign.
Arises through exertion, not just exertion, but arises through exertion.
Exertion, I think,
Yeah.
is the sign.
Yeah, because
I
that
agree.
makes it does, it's-
Okay. How about this one? The subject sound is an impermanent phenomena because of being an impermanent phenomena.
No,
Why not?
you can't have, I can't say it. I would have to have read it.
I'll
I
repeat
read
it. You read it. Okay, good. And you retained it.
You can't, they can't be the same thing. The
What-
predicate
what-
and the reason cannot be the same thing.
Very good.
Don't ask me why,
that's
because
true.
it said, but that's in there.
All right, what about the property of the subject? The subject sound is an impermanent phenomena because of being an impermanent phenomena. Isn't sound an impermanent phenomena?
But in a syllogism, you're trying to prove something. You can't prove it with itself.
You're right. But is the property of the subject established? It is, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, or is it? Because part of what's included in the property of the subject is necessarily a faultless subject of interest. Is there a person who's going to have a question about sound being impermanent if they've already realized sound is impermanent? No. So this is something that I hope that we can really draw out of what we've been talking about today, is this, although he doesn't use that term, faultless subject of interest, he's described it very clearly, the criteria. See if I can find them. On the bottom of page 101 and top of 102. And they're important. That's what I'm trying to highlight here. So although in the definition of the property of the subject, faultless subject of interest is not mentioned, but it's implied. So we need to understand what those three criteria of a faultless subject of interest is. I remember this did my head in when I first studied Taurig. So I encourage you to think about those two separately, and then how does the faultless subject of interest and the property of the subject, how do they relate? Okay, just a couple more.
We might not go over this right now, but page 107, the second paragraph.
Yep.
He covers why that didn't work.
Okay, good. So he was saying that on page 107,
That's where we ended this.
yes, Dan Perdue was explaining why the syllogism we just talked about doesn't work.
We're going to examine it, where it says note well.
Yes,
We haven't done that yet.
right.
Ah, that's why, because I read it
Oh, okay, you read
a
it.
few hours ago.
Uh-huh, good.
But instead, give us more your.
Okay. I just pulled these out of some examples that I had. Okay, the subject, in an ordinary person who is experiencing manifest suffering, that's the subject, seeds of negativity exist because suffering exists. The subject, in an ordinary person who is experiencing manifest suffering, seeds of negativity exist because suffering exists. That sounds good.
That's right.
Sounds true. Okay, so here's the subject. In an ordinary person who is experiencing manifest suffering, suffering exists. So
Yes.
and if that person is wondering, is it because the seeds of negativity exist? And they're trying to prove karma, or some aspect of it anyway. Okay, yeah, that one works. Yeah.
So the subject there is the ordinary person, the seeds of negative.
In an ordinary person, or you could say in the continuum of an ordinary person.
So that's just a.
In an ordinary person who is experiencing manifest suffering. Kind of a long subject. Okay, how about this one? The subject sound is an impermanent phenomena because of being sound.
No.
No. She's good. Okay, the subject, this basis of leisures and endowments, is that the term Venerable uses? Leisures?
Freedoms and fortunes.
Freedoms and fortunes. The subject, the basis of freedoms and fortunes obtained by oneself, is the subject. It is destroyed in a moment because it is a result. The subject, this basis of freedoms and fortunes obtained by oneself, is destroyed in a moment because it is a result. Yes. This basis of freedoms and fortunes obtained by oneself is a result.
Yes.
And there could be someone who is really wondering if it's destroyed in a moment. Someone who hasn't realized subtle impermanence, or even gross impermanence, probably.
What do you mean by destroyed in a moment? That it's, at the next moment it's a different thing?
It's momentary.
That it's momentary.
Death.
What do you mean?
Okay. Well, the basis of
The basis of freedoms and fortunes.
yeah. In other words, this precious human rebirth is destroyed.
Yeah, just like.
But okay, so yeah, I take your point.
How does so whatever is the result is necessarily momentary? Is that the major premise we're trying to prove here? That it can be destroyed?
I think so. Yeah. Just if it's a result, it's
It must necessarily be.
it's a cause for something else, and it will be destroyed in the next moment. You could think of it that way, or it could also prove coarse, something more coarse, like our basis of freedom and fortunes is going to be destroyed in terms of death. Okay, take the subject sound. It is a sound because of being an impermanent phenomena. No.
Take sound is.
It is a sound.
And this computer would be a sound because of being an impermanent phenomenon. Or the desk.
If you knew the subject was impermanent phenomena, would you be wondering whether the subject is the subject? Probably not. So these are some of the pseudo reasons that will come out as we continue studying. Okay, that's probably enough for one evening.
Yeah,
All right.
I think there's more than one evening.
All right. My pleasure. Thank you for your participation. And now we'll dedicate on page 30 and then 71. So first of all, rejoice that we even have the opportunity to study this beautiful text, Course in Buddhist Reasoning and Debate, and that we started with a good motivation tonight. We've accumulated some merit. Whether we've accumulated knowledge or not, that's debatable, but we have accumulated some merit. Yeah, we can make a syllogism out of that. All right.